This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. Today's guest has written one of the most acclaimed literary debuts of the year. Should the Waters Take Us is an epic, multi-generational novel that stretches across 4 centuries from France to Acadia to the disappearing bayous of southern Louisiana. At once intimate and sweeping, it's a story about family, history, environmental change, cultural identity, and the difficult choices that echo across generations. Praised by National Book Award winner Jessamine Ward as deeply talented and wonderful, and earning starred reviews from publishers Weekly, Booklist, and Kirkus Reviews, the novel has already established Stephanie Soileau as a major new literary voice. Stephanie joins me now here on Speaking of Writers. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
It's great to have you. So, this novel has been more than 20 years in the making. What
hmm
was the original spark 20 years ago that stayed with you long enough to become Should the Waters Take Us?
Sure. Well, I think there's sort of the personal, intimate spark that started before, long before. I was raised by my grandparents and my single mom, and they were my grandparents were Cajun French. So they spoke French together. They spoke French with their neighbors. We would go out to the country and see their parents who spoke no English at all. And so I was very much embedded in this culture, very much attached to my grandparents, very much attached to the house that we lived in Lake Charles that they had built themselves, and always had sort of this, this sort of dread that it was going to come to an end. My grandparents were elderly. Cajun culture was not particularly, until the 70s and 80s, was not particularly preserved. And so the next generation after my grandparents didn't speak French. I don't speak any French. So it felt like I was sort of living in this beloved zone that was going to disappear at some point. Later in my 20s, I took a drive down Highway 1 to Lafourche Parish, and which is a very different part of the state, and was totally enchanted by that place. It's a maritime parish. Um, it's a fishing community. People live along the bayou. They eat out of the bayou. There are constantly shrimp boats, oyster boats going up and down the bayou. And I thought that was absolutely beautiful. And I looked around at the landscape, and the landscape is marshy. It's not a dramatic landscape, but it's a very beautiful landscape and an important ecosystem. What I did not know the first time I went down there was how fragile that ecosystem was. So I shortly after that trip, I picked up a book by Mike Tidwell called Bayou Farewell, which is a travelogue about that part of coastal Louisiana, in which he reveals how devastating the forces of erosion have been over the last 50 years, and going forward into the future. So I don't know if you've heard these statistics about coastal erosion in Louisiana, but uh, that part of Louisiana loses essentially 25 to 35 square miles of land a year.
Mm.
They've already lost essentially the state of Delaware. So the
Wow.
place that people call home is literally disappearing underneath them. And I was having conversations with people who, they used to go fishing, go stay at their grandparents' camp. There were orange trees growing. There was land, and now there is no land. It's just gone to water. It's astonishing to see that at work in a landscape. That stuck with me, and it seemed like a bigger story than just the regional one of coastal Louisiana. It's analogous to the kinds of environmental changes that are happening all over the world.
The title itself is incredibly powerful. When did you know that it perfectly captured this story?
Oh, I'm glad you liked the title. It was some struggling to get there. It was originally called Terrebonne after the central family, which means good land. My publisher didn't think that was a lively enough title, so
Hmm.
we kicked around some other options, and landed in just conversation with my agent on this. Should the waters take us? And immediately knew it was right. It Because it sounded to me quite biblical, like something out of the book of Isaiah,
Yeah.
And in fact, when I went looking for for analogous quotations from, I think, in fact, the book of Isaiah, I found, several. So it must have been planted in my memory that way. But I like that it has that sort of biblical scope to it.
The novel spans hundreds of years while remaining deeply personal. How did you balance the epic historical scope here with the emotional intimacy of one family story?
Yeah, well, I think I'm very interested in how we tell our own family and cultural histories, and how we make decisions in the present based on those histories. So that was part of my thinking, and including the long past. But also, it seems to me a very relevant part of the question of why people stay, or how they move, how they get attached to the place that they're in, whether the place is ever really their place. So I wanted the stories from the past to focus on inflection points, times when people were exiled or were just finding a home, and I wanted those historical moments to feel intimate and lived in, not just to be, a distant part of the history, and to have that live alongside what people are experiencing now, which has been a sort of constant, you know, constant assault by forces that seem to be driving them away from the place, and yet they stay.
Louisiana isn't simply the setting here, it's almost another character. What makes this landscape so central to the novel's heartbeat?
I think people, I'm not sure there's a place on this in this country where people feel as attached to the landscape around them as Louisianans do, and they're so proud of that landscape, because it's not just, it doesn't have the grandeur. It's not like the megafauna of Yosemite or whatever, but it's a landscape that people survive on. Like, the beauty of it is that you can go out into the marsh or the Atchafalaya Basin, and haul out dinner for your family.
Mm.
And the smells are so particular, and the sounds, the birds, the wildlife. And it's just, there's so many cultural ways that are tied to that particular wild place. Um, yeah.
You've described yourself, Stephanie, as an informal PhD in Louisiana history.
And
I'm
my
giving
it
yourself that.
aggravates that aggravates my PhD husband to no small degree.
Ecology here, land law too. What was
Yeah.
the most fascinating discovery during those 2 decades of research?
Yeah. Oh, it was all fascinating. Everything I scratched at was just opened up. Um, just new vistas on the tangle that is Louisiana. Um, I think one of the most interesting things that I hope I tried to capture in the book was realizing what a cultural mix Louisiana is. With the the national understanding of what Louisiana is culturally tends to be Cajun, Cajun, right? We all know,
Mm.
oh, the gumbo, and the Cajuns are the cutest people on earth, or whatever. They're the joy de vivre. Um, but that, you know, the name Cajun comes from Acadian, which comes from the exiles from Acadia, who were a very small part of that population in Louisiana, and were joining a culture that warmly accepted them, but that was already existing, and then they started to add their own flavor to it too. So, um, and that culture is made up of, continental French Creoles, Caribbean, African people of African descent, indigenous people, and the Chinese shrimp drying industry was apparently huge in coastal
Mm.
Louisiana during the late 1800s. That was an interesting detail to me, that it was such a cultural, you know, gumbo, I guess.
Mm. I'll ask you about a couple of the characters. Boy Broussard,
Sure.
wonderfully complex character, a flawed man trying to become a father under impossible circumstances. Drew you to writing him?
I knew I wanted there to be a character who was very tied to the land, in contrast to the his antagonist, who's also a protagonist in the book, Jacques, who's he wants to be more of a modern man. I was very much inspired by the story of Jacob and Esau, and the conflict between them. Esau is a hunter. He's a man of the old ways. Jacob is the modern man who lives in tents. He wants the blessing. He wants to go forth and sort of modernize. So I was trying to find, you know, modern examples that fit those analogs. So boy, um, and he's also very much in spirit like my own father.
Mhm.
You know, my dad he wasn't Cajun, and he wasn't a fisherman, but of he was that kind of philosophical. You know, Boy is actually an incredibly smart man. And I wanted this character to be, you know, not just some backwoods dummy. He knows the place about as well as you can know a place, and he has a sort of personal philosophy about it. You know, he's interested in in transcendence and nothingness. Yeah.
Father Fabian brings a
Yes.
unique perspective from the Niger Delta, another region deeply affected by oil extraction. Why was it important to connect those two worlds?
Well, I think again, you know, I was trying not to, or I was trying to think of this, and always did think of this story that happens to be set in Louisiana as not just a regional story. This is a global story, of relationships um, with industries that are not necessarily taking care of the places that they use for their capital. You can see that happening again. I was just reading an article about Meta establishing a data center in my home state again. And
Mm.
so, uh, and I was particularly interested in the Niger Delta because I very much admired some of the activism, like Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was an Agoni activist who was executed in 1995 by the Nigerian government, um, for, you know, I mean, he was framed for a murder, but he was making too much noise about the oil industry and its depredations on his people's homeland. So I was interested in that, and also in the way that, you know, in the US, as bad as the Deepwater Horizon oil spill was, like every resource is going to be thrown at the problem until there's no more problem, right? That not so in other places. And when we here, you know, have a moratorium on offshore drilling, or you know, when we say not in our backyard, it's going in somebody else's backyard. And so I wanted that to be front and center too.
Many readers will discover Acadian and Cajun history through your novel. What do you hope they learn beyond the historical facts?
Mm. I hope they learn that I think that a lot of the difficult decisions, a lot of the things, the forces, the larger forces at work, for example, the oil industry, Meta, um, are able to do their work because people are making decisions on the ground. And sometimes those decisions are what they think is best for their family, for themselves in the moment. In the long term, perhaps not. And that is something that we are all We are all complicit in all of this. And yes, I hope you learn about Cajuns and Acadian culture and Louisiana culture, but I hope you can also see the universal in this problem.
Stephanie, there's extraordinary compassion in the way you portray every character, even those making difficult decisions. How do you approach writing characters without judgment?
Uh, excuse me. It's I've always thought that real love for a place or a person involves seeing that person as a whole person, like giving them a full compliment, recognizing the full complement of who they are, for better or for worse. My relationship with Louisiana has always been that, much to the aggravation of some of my fellow Louisianans. I'm happy to point out the flaws, but also happy to, love it for what it is. And I think the same is true of people. And I think you do an individual tremendous respect in seeing them, you know, in all of their glory and grandeur and smallness of spirit. Um, and yeah, and if you can see all of that and still somehow love them, then yeah, I think that's my goal always in writing a character.
Every writer hopes their work stays with readers long after the final page. When readers close, should the waters take us, what conversations do you hope continues in their hearts and minds?
I hope they continue asking questions about what it means to belong to a place and whether we can ever really belong to a place. I wrote this book trying to find an answer to that question. That was the central question in my mind. I don't have an answer, but at least the question is sort of laid out there in all its angles and possibilities.
Should the Waters Take Us is a remarkable novel, one that beautifully captures family, memory, culture, resilience, and the fragile relationship between people and the places they call home. Stephanie Soileau, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Steve. I enjoyed our conversation so much.
Same here. And thank you for watching and for listening. The novel, Should the Waters Take Us, is available wherever books are sold. And don't forget to subscribe to the Speaking of Writers podcast on Spotify, YouTube, Apple, and wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Steve Richards. Keep reading. Thank you for watching and for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.